I am the Ascended Master, Jesus Christ. It was not my intention to speak at this conference, having had my say last time. But because of the many questions you asked the messenger about Christhood, I decided it would be helpful for you to give you a discourse on this topic. My beloved, the first thing we need to recognize is that personal Christhood, where you personally put on the Christ consciousness, is the greatest threat to the dark forces and the false teachers on this planet. They have therefore done everything they could possibly think of to prevent people from knowing about Christhood, seeing it as a realistic possibility for themselves, and understanding the process of attaining Christhood and what it means. They have done everything they could think of to create all kinds of diversionary tactics where they set other spiritual goals that are perhaps in some cases leading to a heightened state of awareness, but are not as much of a threat to them as Christhood. They have also done everything they could think of to define Christhood in a certain way so that people attain or strive for an ultimate goal and then suddenly think that now they have attained it and they do not need to go further. So, my beloved, the most important thing you can realize about Christhood is that it is an ongoing process. You can attain Christhood while being in physical embodiment, but there is no ultimate state of Christhood that you could attain while in physical embodiment. We may say that there is no ultimate state of Christhood in the sense that there is no ultimate state of consciousness except perhaps the creator consciousness, but even that is transcending itself as it is creating. So you need to recognize here that there is no ultimate state. Life, awareness, self-awareness is an ongoing process. There is always the possibility of self-transcendence. There never was a static state in the world. There never was a static state in the world, and there never will be. There never was a beginning, and there never will be an ending. There can be a beginning of a cycle and the ending of a cycle. But there was no ultimate beginning before which there was nothing. There was a beginning of our world of form, where the Creator existed in itself. But this was not the ultimate beginning, for there never has been an ultimate beginning. There never will be an ultimate ending. This is something that the linear mind finds it very difficult to grasp. And that is why you need to understand that you cannot understand Christhood. You can, however, come to understand that you cannot understand Christhood. And when you understand that you cannot understand Christhood and why you cannot understand Christhood, then you may begin to grasp at least glimpses of what Christhood is. You need to recognize here that most people on earth have been programmed to think through the linear, analytical, rational mind. This mind cannot understand or grasp or deal with Christhood. Christhood goes beyond what the linear mind can deal with. That is why you also need to understand that the way you look at Christhood now is not the ultimate way to look at Christhood. It is not possible for me, even as an ascended master, to give you an ultimate discourse on Christhood, because Christhood is a process of gradually raising your consciousness. We have given you the knowledge that there are 144 levels of consciousness that are possible on earth. We can therefore say that Christhood is the process where you start at the 48th level and then raise your consciousness gradually to the 144th level. At the 144th level, you have attained the highest degree of Christhood that is possible on earth in its current state. This means, my beloved, that when you start at the 48th level, you can have a certain understanding of Christhood, but it is not the full understanding. As you grow towards higher levels of consciousness, your understanding of, your grasp of, your experience of Christhood will change. You will not gain the full grasp of what Christhood is until you reach the 144th level. Therefore, you can see that it is not possible to give a definition of Christhood that can be grasped by all the many levels of consciousness between the 48th and the 144th level. Why am I saying that this begins at the 48th level? Because for those who are below the 48th level, they cannot grasp Christhood. They may, of course, hear the concept of Christhood. They may also decide that they want to attain Christhood, but they cannot grasp what Christhood truly means. Therefore, they can build some kind of intellectual, rational, linear perception of what Christhood is. They may even think they are making progress towards this goal, but they are not, my beloved. You can raise your consciousness from the lowest level to the 48th level, and you are making progress in a spiritual sense, but you are not even beginning the process of putting on Christhood. And the reason for this is that you are still too tied to the outer mind that thinks it can understand everything by creating these labels and then adding a value judgment to the label they have created based on the dualistic mindset. And then they think they can define Christhood based on a set of outer criteria, and then they think they can set up a list that says, when you live up to this criteria, put a check mark, then go on to the next criteria, put a check mark, and when you have completed the list and you have a check mark at every point, then you have attained Christhood. This is the only way they can conceive of it, those who are below the 48th level. And there are many false teachers in the world who attempt to give you some kind of path that leads to some kind of goal. They may not call it Christhood, they may call it higher awareness, cosmic consciousness, enlightenment, whatever, but it is all a mechanical path, an outer path, whereby performing certain exercises or rituals or studying certain teachings, learning them by heart, they think they can qualify for entry into heaven by living up to a set of criteria defined here on earth. Now, my beloved, when you go above the 48th level of consciousness, you can begin the process of Christhood. You will still may have many misconceptions about Christhood, but you will, in order to go above the 48th level, have the essential quality that is the beginning of the process of Christhood, and that is your willingness to listen to your intuition, even when your rational linear mind tells you something different. In other words, what happens at the 48th level is that you begin to follow your intuition in certain cases, and therefore you ignore or put aside or neutralize your rational, linear, logical, intellectual, analytical mind. You will see, all of you who are here, and you are all above the 48th level of consciousness, or you would not be here, you will see that there are decisions you have made to engage in the spiritual path that your friends or family find it difficult to understand because they have a rational, linear reasoning that says that you should not be doing what you are doing or believing or accepting what you are accepting. You may not be able to give them a rational, linear understanding that they can accept for why you are doing what you are doing. You just know that this is the right thing for you. This then is the essence of Christhood between the 48th and the 96th level. You are rising higher in consciousness by dealing with the 7 rays as we have described in the Course of Self-Mastery, where the Chohans give you a gradual path. As you do this, you are increasing your intuition, which is truly your connection to your I Am Presence and your ascended teachers. And this means that you become more and more willing to ignore your own rational mind, but also to ignore the impulses, the projections that are coming to you from without, whether it be from other people, such as family or friends, or from society, the mass consciousness, or dark forces, or whatever it may be. As you rise higher, there will be more of these projections, but you get better at not letting them affect you. Because as you rise towards the 96th level, you increase your ability to read vibration, to read the energetic level of another person who is talking to you, an idea that comes to you, or even a projection that comes to you from the lower forces. You get better at reading the vibrational level, and then you get better at sensing when it vibrates below a certain level and when it vibrates above it. Now, my beloved, what I am telling you here is that when you go above the 48th level of consciousness, you have established in your own being, in your heart, a certain vibration that you know is higher than the fear-based vibrations of the world. It is sort of the highest vibration you are capable of recognizing with your level of consciousness. So at the 48th level, for example, you have a certain base vibration you can recognize. And therefore you can recognize that there are things that are very clearly vibrating below that level, and some that are vibrating above that level. But you may have difficulty recognizing something that is too far above. You may also have difficulty distinguishing between your base vibration and something that is slightly below it. But you can clearly sense the difference between your base vibration and something that is very far below it. Now, as you go higher on the levels towards the 96th level, you raise the vibration you are able to recognize. This means that you can now recognize higher and higher vibrations. And of course, you do not forget the base vibration you had at the 48th level, so you can now recognize a greater and greater span of higher vibrations. This also means that you become better at distinguishing those vibrations that are slightly below the 48th level. And therefore, it becomes more and more difficult for the dark forces to fool you. There comes that point when you reach the 96th level where you have achieved the ability to read any vibration that the fallen beings can throw at you from beneath the 48th level. In other words, you cannot be fooled by a vibration that is below the 48th level, no matter how cleverly it is disguised. You can recognize the vibration alone. This, however, does not mean that you have attained the fullness of Christhood. In fact, it is actually the preliminary stages of Christhood, and the real process of attaining personal Christhood, becoming the living Christ, starts above the 96th level. However, at the 96th level, you do face a crucial initiation. And this is an initiation that you saw me go through at the beginning of my mission. It is not depicted particularly well in the scriptures, but you do have, for example, the situation at the wedding in Cana, where my mother had to push me into turning the water into wine and thereby stepping forward to begin my public mission. There are also other hints in the scripture, such as the baptism by John the Baptist, and there are other more subtle hints. But the point here is that when you are at the 96th level, you face a crucial decision. You can continue to pursue spiritual growth in order to elevate yourself and your own state of consciousness. Or you can make the choice that from this point forward, you are pursuing spiritual growth not to elevate yourself, but to serve in elevating the whole. The difference may seem subtle. It seems subtle because it is subtle. In fact, most people below the 96th level will not be able to grasp the subtlety, and those below the 48th will not be able to grasp it at all. They will not even be able to see why there should be such a choice. But my beloved, Christhood at the higher levels of consciousness are not about raising your own consciousness, your own self. Do you understand, my beloved, that between the 48th to the 96th level of consciousness, you are raising your individuality as you see it above the pull of the mass consciousness. As the mass consciousness is on earth today, there is no way you can manifest a higher state of consciousness while you are influenced by the mass consciousness. Therefore, at the 48th level, you come to the realization that you have the potential as an individual to raise yourself up above the mass consciousness. So, at the 48th level, you have a certain sense of self, a certain sense of identity, of a mental understanding of who you are, an emotional grasp of who you are, and a physical conscious understanding of who you are. As you see yourself as at the 48th level, this is the self you begin to raise. Now, of course, that self is transformed as you move towards the 96th level. But you are still fundamentally conceiving of yourself as an individual human being who is walking a spiritual path and raising your level of consciousness. And it is inevitable, it is necessary, and there is nothing wrong with it, that you have a motivation for why you want to raise yourself, why you want to attain a higher level of consciousness. However, this also gives room for the false teachers to influence you in subtle ways. And they have done this by, for example, portraying Christhood or enlightenment or cosmic consciousness as a supernatural state, where you attain some supernatural abilities, such as turning the water into wine, walking on water, raising the dead, whatever have you. And so they make you think that you become a superhuman that has supernatural abilities. And there are many people who have a desire to have such abilities and who have a desire to go out and demonstrate these abilities to other people. They may have a benign, seemingly benign desire to attract people to the spiritual path, but behind it is always this self-centered motivation of elevating themselves above others. In other words, there is an element of the self-centered as you are walking the paths from the 48th to the 96th level. And so the initiation you face at the 96th level is, will you abandon this self-motivated desire for growth? And will you step up to a higher motivation where you realize that the real goal of attaining your ascension is to now begin to dismantle the self that you have used as a vehicle for rising from the 48th to the 96th level. Now you may liken this to a space rocket, my beloved, that has two stages. One is the motor with a huge fuel tank that is needed to carry the rocket beyond the gravitational pull of the Earth. It is necessary to have that self between the 48th and the 96th level. I am not blaming anyone. There's nothing wrong with this. It is necessary. But as you see with a rocket, once the rocket has gone into space, it does not need that huge booster and fuel tank, because it was only needed to take it to that stage. And therefore it must separate itself from it and let it fall away. And so the crucial distinction at the 96th level is between those who grasp this and those who do not. There are those who at the 96th level continue to seek to elevate themselves. And then there are those who see the need to actually let go of the self they had or they have at the 96th level. This does not mean that they can instantly let go of it. For there is always a certain need for continuity so you can function in the material realm. And so therefore what I'm saying is that once you get to the 96th level and grasp what the higher stage of Christhood is about, you engage in a process that step by step leads you from the 96th to the 144th level. And this process is not about elevating yourself, giving yourself some special abilities, making yourself superior to other people. It is actually about dismantling the self that separates you from other people. Do you see, my beloved, it may seem contradictory that you need a certain self to pull yourself above the mass consciousness. And then, once you have done that, you need to dismantle that self and strive for oneness with all people. But the fact of the matter is that while you are affected by the mass consciousness, you are not in oneness with other people, you are not in oneness with your I Am Presence, you are not in oneness with the Ascended Masters. You are simply in this mechanization state where we have said that the fallen beings have attempted to make everyone the same. That, my beloved, is not oneness. It may be sameness, but it is not oneness. You see, oneness in a spiritual sense is where you recognize your divine, your spiritual individuality, but your spiritual individuality does not set you apart from others. We who are ascended masters recognize our individuality. I recognize my own individuality as distinct from Master Moore's or Saint Germain's, but we are not in conflict or in competition with each other. We have achieved a degree of oneness that you cannot fathom in the unascended state. But you can begin to fathom it as you move closer to the 144th level. And so, you see, my beloved, these are the two main stages of Christhood. And that is why, when you are below the 96th level, you can have a certain view of Christhood, a certain grasp, a certain understanding of what you think it is. But once you go above the 96th level, you begin to realize that it is much more. It is something, in fact, maybe completely different from what you thought at your previous level of consciousness. So it is extremely, extremely important that whatever level you are at, you adopt the conscious attitude that you do not, at your present level, have the full grasp of what Christhood is. Therefore, you will not look at a particular definition or view of Christhood and say, this is what Christhood is. And therefore, you close your mind to a higher view, a higher understanding, a higher experience. As you are below the 96th level, you will still think that Christhood is something you can understand. And I am asking you to be aware that even though you may have a certain understanding of Christhood, there will come a point where that understanding needs to be dismissed. And now, instead of understanding Christhood, you are focused on experiencing it. There is a difference between understanding and experience in the sense that while you are understanding something, you are looking at it from a distance. You are saying, Christhood is up there, and I am understanding what it is, and I am understanding how to get closer to it. But what is implied in this is that you are not there. And so, as you come to the 96th level, and as you make that conscious decision to shift away from being focused on yourself to being focused on something beyond the self, then you can begin to experience Christhood. And this again does not mean you experience the fullness of it, but you experience Christhood at a certain stage. And this is where, as the messenger described, you need to come to that point where you are consciously willing to accept that you have achieved a degree of Christhood. If you do not make that acceptance, then you cannot actually truly begin the process of experiencing higher and higher expressions of Christhood. You may think you are the Christ below the 96th level, and we continually see some students who think they can declare that they have attained Christhood while they are still below the 96th level or at the 96th level. But, my beloved, they are declaring this with the outer mind. And this is not what I am talking about. I am talking about a very delicate shift that is not based on the outer mind. It is not making a decision with the outer mind. But it is recognizing that you cannot deny Christhood either. You are recognizing that there is always in the human ego a dynamic of inferiority and superiority. And you recognize that there's a tendency, there's an element of your ego that wants to inflate your own sense of self-importance. And therefore you recognize that those who are affected by this level of ego, they are declaring that they are the Christ before they are actually ready for it, before they have made that decision to stop focusing on self, because they are trying to use Christhood as a way to elevate the separate self to some ultimate status. Then on the other hand, you also see that there are those who are caught in the inferiority aspect of the ego, and they are thinking that they should not recognize that they have reached a certain stage of the path. They should be humble, they should not bring attention to themselves, and they should be so concerned about not being prideful that they actually switch to the opposite extreme of being prideful because they are so humble and not declaring themselves to have reached any certain stage. You see, pride can be expressed as both inferiority and superiority. And so when you recognize this, you recognize that it is necessary to look at yourself, to look at your psychology, to look at both aspects of the ego, the inferiority aspect, the superiority aspect, to come to see how they have affected yourself. And then as you go through this process of exposing this dynamic of the ego, there comes that point where you have seen through it. And you see that you are more than this. This is not who you are. This does not define you. And then you see that you actually want to go completely beyond this ego dynamic because you want oneness with your I Am Presence. You want oneness with the Ascended Master who is closest to your heart. And you want that more than any status you could have here on earth. And that is when you can come to that spontaneous inner realization that you cannot declare your Christhood prematurely, but neither can you deny it or ignore it beyond the level where you actually are at in consciousness. And then you come to that realization that it is necessary for you to acknowledge that you have made progress on the spiritual path, you have reached a certain level of consciousness, and therefore you have reached a level of Christhood that is above the 96th level, because you recognize that you are no longer focused on that separate self. You have aspects of it, but you are not focused on it. It is not defining you, it is not defining your path. That is when you acknowledge that you have attained a degree of Christhood, but you also acknowledge that it is not the highest degree of Christhood, and therefore you realize that between the 96th and the 144th level, this is a process that is not the way many people think it is. This is not the stage where you attain some supernatural ability. Supernatural abilities are not an essential part of Christhood. There are people who have attained Christhood, who have qualified for their ascension without ever displaying any supernatural abilities, without ever being recognized by others, because those who are below the 48th level cannot even recognize people at the higher levels, and most people below the 96th level cannot recognize them very easily either. And so you see that at this stage, you are not focused on the world. You are in the sense that you are focused on living up to certain images or expectations. You are not seeking to impress the world. You are not seeking validation from the world. You have become what you might term a higher sense of spiritual self-sufficiency, where you don't need the recognition or the validation of other people or the world. You don't need to be validated by others, because you are validated from within yourself by your experience of a greater degree of oneness than you had before. You can still remember how it was when you didn't have the sense of oneness with your I Am Presence or with the Ascended Masters that you now have. And therefore, you are not looking at the degree of oneness you have as some theoretical goal that you see from a distance. You are experiencing it. And you experience that as you continually look at yourself and see more limitations, more limiting beliefs, and let them go, then you achieve a higher degree of oneness. And so you realize that the path between the 96th and the 144th level is actually a path of continual self-observation, where in every situation you're observing your own reactions, and whenever you see a reaction that you know vibrates below the level that is the base vibration you now recognize, then you look at it openly and honestly. You're not seeking to hide it for yourself, you're not seeking to excuse it, but neither are you condemning yourself, because you have gone beyond the need to condemn yourself in any way. You are not finding fault with others, you are not finding fault with yourself, you are not judging with that dualistic value judgment. You are simply observing. You observe that there's something here that is limiting you, and then you look at what it is until you discover the mechanism, and then you realize how you let that self die and you rise to a higher level. So you see, my beloved, below the 96th level, striving for Christhood is based on the perception you have with the outer self. It is based on raising yourself beyond the pull of the mass consciousness. Now, as you go above the 96th level, and in fact, in order to go above the 96th level, you need to pass the initiation that I described when I said that if you seek to save your life, you shall lose it. But those who are willing to lose their lives for my sake shall find it. And what is meant by this is that you now need to start letting go of aspects of your life, meaning your outer self, the self that brought you to the 96th level. You need to let elements of that self die, because you experience, you feel, you see that it is more important for you to come one step higher in the process of attaining oneness with your I Am Presence, or oneness with the Ascended Master that is closest to your heart. It may be me, it may be any other master you desire. But it is a process of attaining oneness, and you attain oneness with your higher self, with your I Am Presence, only by letting the outer self die step by step, element by element, increment by increment. So this is a process where, in a way, you could be said that it is a continual process of dying, because you are dying to the world. You are letting the worldly self die so that the prince of this world comes and has less and less in you until he finally comes and has nothing in you, because you have let that worldly self die and there is nothing left of it. At that point, there is also nothing that keeps you in embodiment, and that is why you will move into the ascension process. But it is important for you to keep in mind that it is a matter of letting the outer self die. Now, my beloved, I call it a form of death because most people see death as some final stage where something disappears, something dies, something is no more. And this is literally what happens to your outer self. It dies. There's a certain self, a certain element of it, and as Hilarion explained in his latest book, for each of the levels of consciousness, there is a certain illusion. We could also say that there is a certain self that you need to let die at the 96th level in order to ascend to the 97th level. Then there is a self at the 97th level that you are allowed to die in order to ascend to the 98th, and so on. And it is something final. Now, this, of course, you're also doing between the 48th and the 96th level, but you're not conscious of it in most cases. But as you go above that 96th level and make that first decision to let the self die, then you become more and more conscious of this. You see that something is actually dying. It is no more. You are completely letting it go. At that point, you begin to realize that death is not something that happens to you that you are not in control of. Death is actually you consciously letting go of the self that no longer serves you. It is a process over which you are in control, my beloved. You are consciously letting that self die, and you see it as a final act where the self is no more after you have let it go. So you see, my beloved, there are many people who will listen to or read this discourse, and they will feel a certain sense of disappointment, because suddenly what I am describing as Christhood doesn't sound nearly as glamorous as they see it right now. But this only demonstrates to you that you have adopted, to some degree, one of these false images presented by the false teachers of what it means to reach some higher state of consciousness. There is especially one aspect I would like to bring to your attention. It is so typical for spiritual movements, whether it be the major religions or a small spiritual movement centered around a certain guru. It is so typical that they look up to the leader of the movement as being somehow above other people. You will see, for example, how there are many modern spiritual organizations that were started by a certain person, and the people in the movement think that this person is enlightened, my beloved. And they have some often very unclear view of what it means to be enlightened, but they clearly think that the person who is enlightened is somehow above others. But if enlightenment has any meaning as a concept, it would be the same as Christhood. And what is Christhood? It is that you go closer and closer to the 144th level. You begin to see that behind all of the phenomena found in the world, there is an underlying oneness. This means that you begin to see yourself, first of all, in oneness with your I Am Presence and with the Ascended Masters above you. You see that you are part of this ongoing flow of energy from spirit, the upper part of the figure 8. And then as you come closer and closer to that nexus, you begin to see your oneness with all that is below. Not with the fallen beings, with the duality consciousness, but with those who are the self-aware extensions of God, the sons and daughters of God. You see your oneness with all people. And as you go closer and closer to this oneness, all value judgments, all comparisons completely fade away, my beloved. In a sense, yes, it is necessary to say that as you get closer to the 144th level of consciousness, of course you are at a higher level of consciousness than those who are at the 48th level, for example. Naturally, you have risen through a very determined effort very high above the 48th level. But this does not mean that you now see yourself as better or more important than others. On the contrary, your value judgments fade away, and it gives no meaning for you to compare yourself to others. In fact, it gives no meaning to even compare yourself to any scale. You consider less and less where you are at the levels, at the scale of consciousness. You are simply focused on being who you are, expressing your divine plan as you are beginning to see it more clearly, and serving other people, serving the cause of the Ascended Masters of raising all life. This is your focus. So you understand, my beloved, the more enlightened a person is, the less he or she wants to be seen as enlightened when people see an enlightened person as being above them. Because you realize that if other people see you as being above them, they cannot see you as an example to follow. They see a gap between you and themselves, and therefore you cannot inspire them fully to follow the path that you have followed. So you see, my beloved, if a person sets himself or herself up as being fundamentally above others, then that person cannot be enlightened, because if the person was enlightened, he or she would not want other people to put them up there on a pedestal. Instead, the enlightened person would do everything possible to prevent people from seeing a gap and from seeing that all have the potential to follow the same path and reach these higher levels of consciousness where all of the comparisons, all of the value judgments fade away, and as a result of this, you attain a greater and greater degree of inner peace. For there is nothing you have to live up to in the world. There's nothing you have to strive for. There's nothing you have to condemn yourself for. You do not have to judge or evaluate other people. You see, my beloved, when I said, "For judgment I am come," it did not mean that I was come to judge and evaluate and criticize other people. It meant that I came to allow other people to judge themselves by the way they acted towards me. And the ultimate judgment was that they killed my physical body, and thereby attempting to kill the living Christ. Now, fortunately, we live in an age where the fallen beings find it increasingly difficult to kill the living Christ. And therefore, you obviously do not have to go through that experience. I sincerely hope for you. But you understand here that the idea is that I did not come to judge and criticize and evaluate anybody as many people think. As we have said before, we of the Ascended Masters are not sitting up here watching your every action, your every word, your every thought and feeling. We are not criticizing, condemning, evaluating, and judging you, my beloved. We are only seeking to raise you up. And so, this is what you do when you come closer and closer to the 144th level. You become less and less concerned about creating a sense that you are elevated above others. In fact, you become more and more concerned about helping other people raise their consciousness. You are more concerned about raising up others than raising yourself. And therefore, you do what you can to avoid people putting you up on a pedestal. And so, my beloved, these are my thoughts for now. Obviously, this is not meant to be the final word on Christhood, but it is what I determined would be valuable to you based on the questions you have been asking, and that many people around the world have been asking. So therefore, I give you thanks for listening and for being the open doors, for again I could use your chakras to radiate an impetus into Korea and into the world, the mass consciousness of the world, to reach those who have the potential to step forward and recognize their Christhood and begin those higher stages above the 96th level. And so, my beloved, I want to express my deep gratitude for those of you here in Korea who have studied our teachings, who have given our invocations, and who have been so instrumental in bringing the changes you have seen in these past 10 months since our last conference, and obviously even before that conference. We are grateful, and we do, my beloved, recognize your efforts. We are, of course, not in any way seeking to make you feel superior to others, but you understand, my beloved, that when you get beyond that inferiority-superiority dynamic, it is valid to recognize that you have made an effort, it has produced results, and you have made a difference in your nation by what you are doing. And therefore, you can, of course, continue to make a difference. And as you rise to higher levels of consciousness, you can make more and more of a difference. Because, of course, as you rise towards that 96th level, you become more and more of an open door for the impulses and energies from your I Am Presence and the Ascended Masters. And it is this inflow of energy that will make the ultimate difference in raising the earth into the golden age. So you might say that as you come closer and closer to the fullness of Christhood at the 144th level, you become more and more of an open door for radiating the golden age consciousness into the world. And this means that in many cases, you may have to do less and less on the outer. And that is why you have seen some people who have withdrawn to a cave and sat there and held the spiritual balance. But of course, in this day and age, it is also very important that most of the people who are striving for Christhood engage themselves actively in society, and therefore you become the examples. Because as we have said many times, the matrix where there is one person who is seen as the example was a Piscean phenomenon. And in the Aquarian age, we need many people to be the examples. That is why an Aquarian age organization does not elevate one leader to some supreme status, but sees that all people have the potential to serve as examples and be the open doors. And thus, my beloved, my gratitude for your willingness to be the open doors for my release of light this day.